Well, exactly a year ago, this week, it was announced that David was to be our new dean, and we've been delighted to have him with us, and indeed he's already made a big impression on being here. David was born at Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. He went to Durham University and studied zoology, which must be very useful for a dean of Canterbury Cathedral.
It is.
He then went on to read theology and did a PTH at St John's, Nottingham, and later on did an MA in mission ministry, which I think again was at Nottingham, wasn't it? Yeah, that's right. And he spent 5 years at St Martin the Field, which of course is highly relevant to everything we're going to talk about today. The centre above all other centres in this part of England for social welfare and justice. He had 7 years as priest in charge of Holy Trinity, Wimbledon, and then he spent 13 years at Leicester Cathedral, 9 of them as dean. And so, David, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to sit because I didn't have a chance to print off what I want to talk about, so I need to use my laptop. But I hope that also creates a sense of this is a conversation amongst friends and colleagues rather than a bunch of experts coming to tell each other this is really the way you should live your life and do your social justice. It's really not like that at all. I'm grateful to have a bit more time, which means that I'll do what I was going to do, but do it slightly slower, which is to everybody's advantage, not least mine. And as was said at the start, this is a sort of a platform kind of foundational piece, which hopefully gives us something to bounce off in our thinking throughout the day. And I speak as somebody deeply embedded in the Church of England, and therefore I'm speaking from that perspective. But I wanted to say at the outset, of course there is a huge ecumenical dimension to what I'm saying as well. And those of you who are possibly here from other communities, then, you know, part of the dialogue is to work out the particular contours of how that works out in your sphere of operation. And this is a reflection about communities and organisations rather than necessarily about us as individuals, although one can read on from it. Most people still believe that we are still experiencing secularisation in the Western part of the world. And in addition to that, I would argue that we are in a period of dramatic change, just as our world seems to have known approximately every 500 years. And as with the last time this happened in the Reformation and the Enlightenment and so on, it's technology which is driving the change. Except this time round, there is an additional level of complexity which we call climate instability. So the levels of change and reformation are rather more intense than probably we realise, because we are the ones living through it. Those who will tell this story in 500 years' time will see it rather more clearly than we do, I suspect. But all of that means that the so-called linear projections from a religious existence to a more secular existence are certainly no longer linear, if they ever were. However, as Western secularist theory proposed, the church is shrinking, and it is still shrinking. And I suspect no matter what we attempt to do relating to growth, it will still be shrinking, because that's part of the curve that we happen to be in. Now that smaller church helps us to move away from an empire or colonial privileged attitude. It's only really since the Second World War that the church has rediscovered the theology of humble service as we follow a servant king. You know, kenotic Christology was largely a modern invention, even though, of course, it dates back at least to somebody washing somebody's feet. So in this cycle of church history in the West, we seem perhaps to hold true as much to being faithful and small as to necessarily growing. And when that is worked out in practical social action, then perhaps I would look to the language of something like Matthew's Gospel to describe what we're being called into. You might call it a pinch of salt mission theology. Small things that can make significant differences. Very different from the time of empire. Extensive people movements into Europe and the global impacts of the destruction of the World Trade Center have meant that there's been a slowing of the secularization graph. Some people suggest that is just a local or a timing blip, whilst others conclude that perhaps religion is not entirely going to disappear. This process is taken up by the public intellectual Jürgen Habermas, who coins the phrase the post-secular. He's the heavyweight secular thinker, equivalent in my mind to that of the Catholic writer Charles Taylor, who in 2008 published the extraordinary book, The Secular Age, where in light of secularization, he comes to speak about two civilizations. And whilst I absolutely have loved reading Charles Taylor's book, I strangely have found more wisdom and help from Habermas than in Taylor, which seems to me at worst could become a rather sort of bipolar way of thinking about the world and history. Habermas has been long interested in the nature of the public square, the public sphere. For much of his writing and thinking, he did not reckon on religion being a serious player with much to offer the public. Of course, there have been many critiques of his work, not least that it's very male, very Western, and certainly very entitled. That said, he noted, for example, how despite being formed by some very high rational ideals, when you look at a secular state such as France, such a country was largely unable to adapt and even felt that it was under threat by its own French citizens who were Muslim, wishing to wear cultural clothing associated with their traditions of faith. Habermas argues that such members of a society need to be able to contribute to the shaping of that society. And he uses the phrase post-secular for this era, for the interface between the secular and those who continue to be religious. His notes on post-secular society, also published in 2008, reflect really words that originally came from President Sarkozy, which he used when Pope Benedict visited France, and all those great debates about hijabs and so on were going on. Sarkozy called for a positive secularism that debates, respects, and includes, not a secularism that excludes. So Habermas concedes that religion should have voice in the public realm. He argues, therefore, that pure religious talk can only work in the public realm if it's translated, so that its underlying rationality within any given proposition can be apprehended without necessarily its religious hue. And unsurprisingly, this particular methodology has been questioned as to how far it's really possible to do that kind of stripping back, and what might utter rationality actually mean when in the end we are speaking about human culture and our societies. Nevertheless, with all those qualifiers, one of the leading secular philosophers of our time is positively arguing for the real and rich contribution of faith to our public debates, and therefore on the shaping of public policy and the allocation of resources towards justice. Habermas argues for dialogue and translation, and within that a kind of playfulness on both sides, hence the title of my talk. When it comes to working with civic and public officials, certainly in my experience, it's not been an easy ride. Most of those officials are completely illiterate about religion. And I don't mean slightly, I mean completely. They're illiterate about the ways that faith speak and what faith matters to people, and are largely unwilling for much permeation between these dialogues. I'll just give you one example. I chair the College of Deans for the Church of England, which meant I sat on the COVID emergency group that was created, and we met twice weekly for 2 years, working out all the policies and so on that went on. There were actually people behind those announcements when everybody in parishes was complaining about not knowing what was happening and so on. And part of the problem was that every time we talked to Downing Street or to Whitehall, we were met with a complete lack of comprehension about what we were saying. So that, when, for example, there was, talk about the way people prayed together and how it was possible, in Christian churches to pray separately with spaces. People had no idea that in Islam, to be part of the Ummah, to come together in prayer, meant you had to pray side by side. It was less than GCSE levels of understanding of faith within our government, with our Christian traditional background. So it is as bad, if not worse, than you think. They resist permeations to these dialogues, at least they have been recently. However, things are changing, particularly as their obligations to citizens increase through ever more protective legislation. So take, for example, the requirements to care for unaccompanied child migrants. That lands to Kent County Council largely in this area. If you want to know why there are more holes in the roads, it's because of ever more obligations of care, but of course what the bureaucracies are finding, it's impossible to meet them because their financial resources are diminishing, and so they are forced to look for innovative solutions. And this invariably means partnerships. Initially, this has often meant trying to pour the voluntary sector, often inspired by religious motivations, into connections which are shaped by processes and frameworks which, in the end, do not result in partnerships. Because they are bureaucratic and organisational, they are not about human people working together in creative ways. We religious think of partnerships as primarily being relational rather than as functional. And so the secular authorities are having to adapt to people like us. However, this is like swapping from using Microsoft to using a Mac. Not everything works when you try and do it. As someone who is not a gifted linguist, I get the sense of bewilderment that comes in asking for translation. When trying to use another language, in my experience, you just have to hold your nerve and have a go, recognizing that you may well get it wrong. and look a fool. But that's how you learn. David Bosch, the South African mission theologian, spoke of these encounters as needing bold humility. Bold humility. Indeed, ideas from cross-cultural Christian missions, such as inculturation, the incarnating of Christian ethics or practices in any given society, have much to teach us about this act of translation. Indeed, by framing the act of translation as a practice of inculturation, we are kept alert to all the blind spots that have so beset Christian missional activity down the centuries. Some of you may remember reading about the missionary in Barbara Kingslover's novel, The Poisonwood Bible, who, without due attention to translation, tries to proclaim Jesus is Lord, but instead announces Jesus is poison. Therefore, the local indigenous people fill the lake with Jesus and kill all their fish, their primary food source. Translation is risk-laden. However, when there is sufficient translation, there is the capacity to enter into dialogue. In dialogue, we speak as well as listen, and in the listening, there can be the kind of encounter that leads to revelation. And in that encounter, the church itself starts to become more authentically the church, as it learns more to receive rather than to give. Reception is the primary mode of the church's stance in dialogue, not one of giving. We are here to listen, just as Mary listened to the angel. That foundational story has largely been lost in our colonial era. So let me give you a brief example of the kind of ministry I am thinking about. And it comes from Leicester, where I used to be. I've only been here 10 months, so I don't have enough good stories from here yet. That will come in time. So when it came to homelessness in Leicester, there was no real dialogue going on across the agencies or across people who were concerned about those on the street. At best, it was a dialogue of the hard of hearing, where trust between those agencies and people was non-existent. And the local authority was increasingly paralysed under its statutory obligations and without resources to fulfil them. We, as people of the church, who personally encountered many homeless people, recognised the need for humane and meaningful interventions. But we had become irritants simply to the public authorities. However, we started to gain a little bit of credibility when we clubbed together across the denominations, and indeed in Leicester across the faith communities in the pre-pandemic world, in offering a winter night shelter that moved around our parish church halls, our gurdwaras, mandirs and mosques. We didn't go asking the local authority for anything other than help with ensuring health and safety and risk were being managed properly by us who were very much amateurs. But suddenly we began to have a little bit of common syntax. An act of translation had happened. And from this grew dialogue, and eventually the formation of a group that would devise a homelessness charter, learning from good work that had been done in the city of Manchester. One of my colleagues on the Cathedral team led the process, and we became the honest broker in bringing all the parties together. This charter, signed by the elected city mayor, the leader who was Labour, and the leader of the county council who was Tory, the dean and the bishop, both whose politics are undeclared, became a platform for further conversation and for addressing the inherent competitiveness that had grown up between the agencies as they all clambered for the same pots of money. It helped address the projection and scapegoating that is often prevalent now in fields of contestation, where the need is enormous and the resource is finite, and the temptation to blame somebody else is very apparent. It was not a formal set of partnership agreements. Rather, it became a forum for dialogue where we held a safe enough space for listening and new cooperation. And it is growing from strength to strength. This kind of dialogue between the religious and the secular is now pretty rare, I have to say. It's much rarer than it used to be. The Roman Catholic theologian Stephen Bevans puts it like this: the way we live as Christians, which is to live in mission, is constantly to live in dialogue with and discerning our context, and correlating the context with the broader and much older Christian tradition. In other words, it's an act of translation. And the working out of this became part of the building of firmer ground, and the place where we could get beyond powerful and powerless, entitled and excluded, into actually making some decisions and taking some actions that made a difference to ordinary people's lives. The secular realised we had far more reach into far more communities. Not only because we were Christians and therefore had some foothold in every community, but because many social justice-minded Christians also worked in other networks, and particularly in other complex faith-related networks, which brought together many of the other world faiths, who, in the terms of the secular, had become, on the spreadsheet, hard-to-reach groups. Imagine dismissing 51% of the population in Leicester as hard-to-reach groups. Working more and more with such groups opened up possibilities, and even it opened up new streams of funding for the secular powers, who in another bit of their life had to fulfill their diversity targets. But it's win-win. However, my second and perhaps more substantive comment is put more directly to us as social justice practitioners motivated by faith-based convictions. I observe that despite now greater openness for partnerships, that the Church has often backed off. There has been a very gradual process of faith removing itself from informing public dialogue with public institutions. We see from our newspapers that it is now simply not accepted that bishops are allowed public views regarding society. And with this comes the loss of the practice of public faith dialogue and the ability of wider society to hear or be informed by a Christian or faith vision of justice. Whilst there may be religious-based commissions on this or that issue, none of them have had the significance nor the confidence of a document such as Faith in the City, commissioned and published by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Church of England in 1985. This, of course, brought to sight the growth of the urban poor, and the poor housing, poor public services, poor health, and poor economic outputs in such areas. It was the talk of everybody. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet couldn't stop talking about it, even though they didn't like it. But it was there, and it was in the public realm, and dialogue did happen. I was ordained in 1993, and I've seen a steady decline in what might be described as a sane, rational Christian voice being heard in mainstream society. The Christian contribution now largely emits from a privatised sort of religion, whether that be a religion of the left or of the right in terms of theology and politics, but primarily related to a narrow range of faith issues, often tied in with a cultural war. The Church of England has moved out of, or seems to be moving out of, this space. This is not to say that there are not vivid examples of Christians and Christians from the Church of England working for public good in food banks or other charitable social institutions. In some cases, they even make it clear what lies behind that commitment to public service. But very often the dialogue is not going on amongst the people who have the real power or the people who have potential to be the real influencers. Think even about your local village church, even in a very small community. It used to be sufficiently functional to have the capacity to know pretty much everybody in the village round about. And amongst the village would be influencers and thinkers who were the spies and outliers who build social capital and enhance trust so that elected and other public leaders might begin to take serious a religious voice. So at drinks parties and social gatherings, ears would be bent about the impact of cancelling that bus service to that local village. And that public leader then would go into their council meeting with their neighbour down the road ringing in their ears, and the church would have made that sort of dialogue possible. Similarly, in larger communities, the church is one of the principal providers of education in schools and in some tertiary settings, or the founders and inspiration for healthcare institutions such as hospitals and hospices, understood themselves to build relationships in these kinds of worlds and to invest time in these connections. As a curate, I was taught how to go and discover who were my local councillors, to go and insist on having a meeting with my local MP, to spend time getting to know the local doctors and the head teachers, to go and visit the local police station when a new local commander took up post. These all were in the same category as getting to know the other local church and faith leaders. And as I occasionally am invited to come in and talk with ordinands and new clergy these days, and I ask them, do they do these kinds of things? I am met with a blank largely in the room. It's just not part of the ecology for most people anymore. Needless to say, I encourage them to do it when they tell me that. And local church leaders are now faced with so many challenges in trying to run sustainable churches that we've become drawn into the church, necessarily and rightly addressing compliance, fundraising, and attending to what increasingly are impossible administrative and pastoral burdens. There's often no time to do more, but as a result, I think society suffers. And I recognise that pull inwards very much coming to be Dean of Canterbury, where there is a lot to sort out internally. It's rare now for a dean or an archdeacon to also serve on a health authority or chair a local regeneration board, when that's what the deans and archdeacons of my days when I was first ordained were doing. We are not often in the spaces, so we are never thought about as likely candidates for the roles, because we're too busy propping up the church. And I have noticed a subtle but a profound change in language coming from the national church institutions. Often they do not speak about the Church of England. Instead, they speak about the Church for England. Not the Church of England, but the Church for England. And deep in that linguistic shift is a move from being foremost incarnated, belonging to somewhere, part of its intimate fabric, to being a kind of agency, doing something to a place or a community. It's a shift to offering something from an understanding of being the church that's rather more about highlighting or helping to reveal something that belongs to us all and is a concern of everyone. The former is about product placement. The latter is about playful, imaginative translation. However, as much as I might regret some of this, I think there is also a kind of liberty and new opportunity. The church has less and less power. Local authorities and other public organisations match this increasingly. It may be only Birmingham who've hit the headlines about going bust, but just about every council in the land is hovering there or thereabouts. Despair, of course, is one response, but I still meet people who want to do the right thing even if they cannot do it. So one of the playful gifts people of faith offer is that of hope. And hope for me is trying to live in the light of what I know of God. It's a call for imagination. It's a call to live as if the great things I believe and preach about, and particularly those to do with our future, are really true. And this does not lead to a manifesto policy list, but rather it leads to an approach to the public realm, which perhaps is a bit more tentative and yet a bit more secure. A bit more blue sky and imaginary, taking us into the territory of God. A bit less committed to any given course of action or project, but a bit more committed in the longer term and a bit more iterative. In the Ireland of my birth, we've always said that the road to peace was built 1 inch at a time. And so perhaps now the practice of faith involvement in our communities as we inhabit them, hopefully. Many have written about the practical and psychological values of play and playfulness. Play is enjoyable, sometimes useful. But the byproduct of play within an anthropological understanding of humanity is culture. It's culture which shapes human behaviour and makes service or enterprise possible. Therefore, playfulness on the one hand within public discourse may well become the kind of creative space that solves something, that addresses a need. And that's important now. We need to be innovative. But the process of playfulness also bequeaths other goods of value, so that we develop memory, or story, or support, or place. The value of these kinds of things had a resurgence through the pandemic when we experienced a variety of deprivations. And it was interesting that some of the most imaginative responses to the pandemic did not originate within the faith communities. Many of us had got stuck in tram lines of engagement or had retreated from engagement entirely. But it was those who were playful who, in the end, fed the hungry, cared for the vulnerable, and discovered afresh the best things in themselves. It can be tempting to think one has much to offer, especially when one is passionate, only to be surprised that there are not many interested in what we are offering. Instead, the church now has to become more like the little boy of the Gospels with his 2 fish and 5 barley loaves. We share it, what we have, with some new friends and see what might come of it from sitting down together and eating together. Maybe someone there has a few tomatoes or maybe someone else has a boiled egg. And with a bit of play, we turn fish and bread, sardines on toast, into a salad niçoise. Rather more delicious, rather more nourishing, rather more colourful and satisfying. So we're undergoing secularisation. The church is much smaller. The gospel still calls us to justice. And we are now post-secular. So the patterns of engagement that we inherited in the modern period are often broken. And in response to secularisation, we are called to be faithful Christians in our witness and in our attempts at social practice. In this new post-secular context, there's opportunity for new engagement, for bold, playful attempts at translation. Having found some common languages together, there's the chance to play, which will fire imaginations, and through that play, build cultures of cooperation and community. In one sense, there's nothing new, yet I think it does feel like a new kind of ecology at work. It reminds me greatly of what many would describe as the work of the Spirit, who of course is given to the church, but was given to the world long before it was given to the church. Indeed, St. Paul in his letter to the Corinthians writes, "To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good." To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Not a manifestation for the church, nor for the government or the local authority, but for the common good. So I want to encourage you to start translating and start playing together in different ways for the common good. Thank you.